Imagine being strapped to a rocket, hurtling toward the moon, and getting struck by lightning. Twice. Most people know the story of Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, one giant leap. But here's what almost nobody talks about. NASA pulled off 6 crewed moon landings in just 3 years. 6. Let that sink in for a moment. Something that by today's standards would seem almost impossible. So what were they actually doing up there? Apollo 12, humanity's second crewed mission to the moon, launched just a few months after Armstrong's historic first steps. It was November of 1969. Charles Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean climbed aboard their Saturn V rocket, ready to make history again. But this mission was going to be anything but smooth. NASA had big plans. The crew brought along a state-of-the-art color television camera, a massive upgrade over the grainy black and white footage from Apollo 11. They wanted the world to see the moon in full color for the very first time. But there was something else riding on this mission, something far more critical. Apollo 11 had actually been a near miss. What most people never knew was that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had been flying off course the entire time they were descending to the lunar surface. They overshot their target by several miles and landed in what was essentially a random spot on the moon. So Apollo 12 had one job: prove that NASA could land exactly where they aimed. And they had a very specific target in mind: the Surveyor 3 spacecraft, a robotic lander that had been sitting alone on the lunar surface since 1967. The plan was to fly 380,000 kilometers through space and land within walking distance of it. No pressure. But before they could even leave Earth, disaster struck. The Saturn V lifted off in the middle of a thunderstorm. Not ideal, but NASA had no choice. President Nixon himself had flown down to Florida to watch the launch, and the next window to reach the moon was months away. So the rocket vanished into the storm clouds above the launch pad. 36 seconds into flight, at over 6,000 feet in the air, lightning hit the spacecraft. Warning lights exploded across the instrument panels. Mission Control lost all contact. The 3 astronauts held their breath. And then, 16 seconds later, lightning struck again. Now at 14,000 feet, the rocket had lost main power, lost guidance, lost navigation. It was flying blind, at full speed, straight toward catastrophe. What saved them was one quick-thinking flight controller on the ground. He'd seen a similar electrical failure during a training simulation and radioed up 3 words that would become legendary among space enthusiasts. __quote_0___. Switching the signal conditioning equipment to auxiliary mode restored power instantly, and the mission was back on. It was the last time NASA ever launched a rocket into a thunderstorm. And then scientists decided to run an experiment. After the astronauts returned to orbit, their lunar module was intentionally crashed into the surface of the moon. The seismometer recorded the impact, and what happened next left everyone speechless. The moon kept vibrating for nearly an hour. Scientists described it like this: the moon rang like a bell. It was the first hint that our natural satellite is a far stranger object than anyone had ever imagined. And then came Apollo 13. 13, an unlucky number for an unlucky crew. About halfway to the moon, an electrical fault inside the service module triggered an explosion in an oxygen tank. 3 men were stranded in deep space, in mortal danger, hundreds of thousands of kilometers from Earth. Millions of people were once again glued to their television screens, but this time not in wonder, in fear. The crew survived, but something changed forever. The danger of spaceflight stopped being an abstract idea and became a brutal reality. And yet, the program didn't stop. Apollo 14 was America's triumphant return to the moon, nearly a year after the Apollo 13 disaster. And to lead this critical mission, NASA called on a true legend, Alan Shepard, the first American in space, who was now set to walk on the moon. He was 47 years old, the oldest Apollo astronaut. But it was his cool head that saved the mission. On the way to the moon, trouble struck again. The command module needed to dock with the lunar lander, a standard procedure performed on every mission. But this time, the docking mechanism failed. 6 attempts, 6 failures. The mission was hanging by a thread. So Shepard shut off the electronics and told the pilot to dock manually, by eye, like Luke Skywalker flying the Death Star trench. And it worked. Apollo 14 made the most accurate lunar landing to date, touching down just 26 meters from the intended target. But Shepard secured his place in history for another reason too. Before the mission, he had secretly attached the head of a 6-iron golf club to his lunar sample collection tool and smuggled 2 golf balls to the surface of the moon. Standing right in front of the live TV camera, in his bulky spacesuit, he wound up and swung. First shot, a miss. Second shot, it flew. Shepard claimed the ball traveled for miles and miles. In reality, it went about 40 meters. But in that moment, America needed exactly that smile. Apollo 14 restored confidence in the program and paved the way for something truly extraordinary. Apollo 15 changed everything. NASA took everything it had learned from 3 previous landings and reached an entirely new level. Astronauts could now spend a full 3 days on the lunar surface. And to make the most of that time, they were equipped with the Lunar Roving Vehicle, a battery-powered electric buggy capable of reaching 15 kilometers per hour and traveling roughly 90 kilometers on a single charge. In that rover, the astronauts crossed mountain ranges and ancient lava fields, collecting rock samples along the way. Among the discoveries was what became known as the Genesis Rock, a piece of lunar material 4.1 billion years old, preserved from the very birth of our solar system. The crew also conducted an experiment that Galileo himself would have dreamed of. Back in the 16th century, the great scientist dropped objects from the Leaning Tower of Pisa to prove that objects of different weights fall at the same speed. But on Earth, air resistance always got in the way. On the moon, there is no air. The astronaut released a hammer and a feather at the exact same moment, and they hit the surface at the exact same time. Galileo was right. It turns out the only thing that determines how fast an object falls is air resistance. Remove the air, and a feather and a hammer hit the ground at the exact same moment. Galileo had figured that out 4 centuries earlier. It just took a trip to the moon to finally prove it. 10 months later, in April of 1972, Apollo 16 arrived on the lunar surface. Their destination, the Lunar Highlands, a region scientists believed had been shaped by intense volcanic eruptions billions of years ago. On board was Charles Duke, a man who had been part of the very first moon landing but had stayed in the command module while Neil and Buzz made history below. Now it was his turn, his boots, his footprints. But the mission delivered a surprise no one expected. The Highlands hadn't been formed by volcanoes at all. Massive asteroid impacts had slammed into the moon with such force that they pushed the terrain upward from below. It was a discovery that fundamentally reshaped our understanding of how the moon formed. And then there was the moon dust. The Apollo 16 crew reported something strange, something almost unsettling. The dust felt greasy against their skin, and it smelled like gunpowder. On a world with no atmosphere, no wind, no rain, the moon had its own distinct scent. And then came the final chapter. December 1972, Apollo 17. By this point, both the public and the politicians had largely moved on. The moon landings had become routine, if you can call landing on another world routine. But NASA wasn't finished, far from it. Apollo 17 would be the most scientifically and technologically advanced human spaceflight ever conducted. And that record still stands today. For the first and only time in history, a professional scientist set foot on the moon. Every previous Apollo astronaut had been a military test pilot trained to conduct science. Harrison Schmitt was a geologist trained to fly a spacecraft. The difference was enormous. Apollo 17 touched down in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, a dramatic landscape surrounded by low mountains with steep cliffs that exposed ancient rock from deep within the lunar crust. The crew spent 75 hours on the surface, 22 of which were spent outside the lander exploring. Using the rover, they covered over 36 kilometers of terrain and ventured more than 7 kilometers from their landing site. What they found challenged another assumption. The moon, it turns out, is not entirely gray. Schmidt brushed away a layer of dust and discovered something remarkable underneath: orange soil. When that soil was analyzed back on Earth, scientists found it was packed with tiny spheres of volcanic glass, brilliantly colored, formed 3.6 billion years ago. A window into the Moon's ancient, violent past. In total, Apollo 17 brought back 741 individual rock and soil samples, 110 kilograms of the Moon, the largest sample return of any lunar mission in history. Those samples form the backbone of everything we know today about the Moon's geological history and the formation of the early solar system. Everyone at NASA knew what was coming. The Apollo program was ending. There was quiet hope that humans would return to the Moon someday, in the not-too-distant future. But everyone understood that Apollo 17 was the closing of an era. Mission Commander Eugene Cernan was the last human being to stand on the surface of the Moon. Before climbing back into the spacecraft for the final time, he paused. And he left the world with these words: "With peace and hope for all mankind." The ladder went up, the hatch closed, and for the last 50-plus years, no human being has set foot on another world.